What's happened to every single fighter from the legendary Season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter? Now 20 years later, man, this makes me feel old. And just a quick disclaimer, take the fight records I say in this video with a grain of salt, because back then it was extremely hard to track down their actual records, and a lot of guys lied about their records. Everywhere you attempt to look say different numbers, and according to Tapology, apparently Nate Quarry has fought a guy that goes by the name of Harry Ballsack. That is not a joke, feel free to go look it up yourself. That blows my mind if that's an actual human being, and that guy's parents would be in the Hall of Fame right next to Dick Buttkiss's parents. The first fighter we're going to talk about is probably the most interesting one on the list, and he's probably by far the strangest, which is fitting that his nickname is Strange Brew, dubbed by Chris Leben. We are talking about Jason Thacker.
Hey, you're Strange Brew. It's done been said.
Most of the fighters that were casted for the first season of The Ultimate Fighter were borderline UFC professionals already. They've had many other professional fights, tons of experience, but Jason Thacker was completely different. He was a Canadian fighter that was completely unknown, had zero MMA fights, but apparently came from a Thai boxing background, and he had such a short stint on the show that all we really knew him by was just being the guy who trained in an abandoned truck stop.
Back home, I basically work out in a old abandoned truck stop in a garage with a couple bags hanging from chains on the roof.
And because he was completely unknown with absolute no experience, he was the very last person picked to a team on the show.
It really started to remind me of a high school dodgeball team, you know, the guy that always gets picked last.
And from the get-go, it was very clear he had never even trained as a professional fighter before, because on day one, Thacker heavily struggled with the training regimen. And because of this, unfortunately, on television, he appeared like a weakling and that type of person people could just point and laugh at. After just the second day of training, he talks about how it might just be too difficult to him, to which Randy Couture talks him into staying longer. But it just gets worse and worse, and on day 4, Thacker refused to go to a training session, but then again was convinced by teammates to just go anyways. But out of nowhere, he had a change of heart. The guy wanted to stay. The guy wanted to train. He wanted to fight. He wanted to prove to himself and to everybody else that he could really do this. But all hopes came shattering down once he was sent home in episode 2 after his team lost a challenge and were forced to send somebody home because of it. To be honest, there may have been some other reasons why he was sent home, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. Unfortunately, on the show, we never got to see him fight because he was sent home too fast, but he would have one fight in the UFC after the show where he would challenge and take on Chris Leben, as they had a little bit of a beef situation going on the show. Unfortunately, he would get TKO'd by Chris Leben and completely disappear for a couple of years. 2 years after that, he would drop a video of himself training a little bit and showing off that abandoned truck stop in Canada, and he decided to do this video because he heard people were just wondering where he was or even if he was still alive. But that video was all we got, and then he completely disappeared off the face of the planet. For years, people working behind the scenes with the UFC would try to track him down. Even when every single cast member was inducted to the UFC Hall of Fame for that legendary first season, they kept trying to find this guy, but they kept failing. With no social media accounts and the only proof of this guy's existence being those 2 episodes on The Ultimate Fighter and just a random update video, no one knew where he was. Where did he go? What happened to him? A man that goes by the name of Chuck Mindenhall seemed to be the only person in the world hell-bent to find this guy. He searched everywhere he could, asked everyone he could, and just kept coming up short until eventually he found him. In their first interaction over the phone, Mindenhall would offer an interview to Thacker, to which Thacker kind of brushed off, and then he wouldn't hear back from Thacker for weeks. A couple more times, Mindenhall would attempt to call the phone number in which he was able to reach Thacker initially, but both times his parents would answer and just say that he was busy at the time. But finally, Thacker would eventually reach back out and admit that he didn't want to talk about the show at all due to stress and the criticism from it, and claiming that it was very taxing on himself and his family. At first, he declined the interview, but Mindenhall was able to convince him to change his mind. And at this point, a decade had passed since he was last even seen or heard from. Turns out Thacker was still living in the same exact spot on the same exact abandoned truck stop. Now kind of resembling a big country Roy Nelson, Thacker would go on to talk about how the taping of the show angered a lot of his fellow countrymen, and because of this, he constantly found himself getting into fights and getting jumped by multiple guys at bars. And it didn't help when in the lead up to his fight against Chris Leben, the UFC promoted him as this championship caliber wrestler, and an alternate Olympian. But in actuality, it turns out that Thacker only wrestled 1 year in middle school. And as for being an alternate Olympian, well, he actually was an alternate Olympian, that was true. But the way the UFC promoted it, you'd think it'd be in wrestling or maybe something dealing with combat sports. But that was actually not the case. He was actually an alternate Olympian in gymnastics. He would also talk about how the show completely ruined his life and how he spends his days taking care of his parents and his brother, who all have severe health issues, and saying that he might have thought about fighting again, but he still hasn't ever fought since the Leben fight. After this interview was released, a GoFundMe was made for Thacker as he received swarms of support and would post a video thanking everyone.
Give a video to say thank you to everybody who worked with Aiden and Chuck Mindenhall, all about the article, and all the MMA community coming, basically around behind me to support me.
In fact, if you want to read about Chuck's full interview and his full experience and how he was able to find Thacker, I will leave a link to it down in the description below. Back in 2018, there was a reunion with all the fighters from season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter, but Thacker did not attend this reunion. However, something I found very interesting while researching about this guy, which mind you was extremely hard, but in the lead up to the Chris Leben fight, the commission would not sanction him without any proof of him having some sort of fight experience. So Dana White forced him to spar a few guys to try to show that he could actually fight, and then eventually Dana White laced up the gloves and got in there himself and started sparring Thacker, so I thought that was pretty cool. Chris Sanford joined The Ultimate Fighter with a record of 4-0, and all 4 wins were coming by a stoppage. Sanford was picked up by Randy Couture with his 7th pick, which unfortunately was second to last for his team. And after losing a challenge yet again, Sanford was sent home without having a fight on the show. Just like Thacker, he was sent packing in episode 2, but he would have 2 more fights after the show before retiring. He would fight in the UFC against Josh Koscheck, to which he lost by TKO, before making a move over to the WEC, where he was able to get a first-round submission and call it a career with a record of 5-1 and with a 100% finishing rate intact. After hanging up the gloves, Sanford ran an international trading company and a wholesale business. Lodune Sincaid was Randy Couture's 5th pick entering the Ultimate Fighter house, holding a record of 6-0 and all 6 of his wins being by stoppage. At the time, the UFC had been watching Sincaid's career very closely before inviting him onto the show, and in episode 2, Sincaid gets highly intoxicated and starts irritating everyone in the house for just repeatedly making gay jokes. He would take on Bobby Southworth in the very first fight on the show and would lose by knockout in the 2nd round. After the show, Sincaid would fight 1 time in the UFC, losing by TKO again against Nate Quarry, but then would go on to have 17 more fights outside of the UFC, with a few of those fights being in the WEC, and even at one point becoming the WEC light heavyweight champion. He would officially retire after losing a bout in March of 2010 and calling it a career with a record of 15-9. Sincaid also did not attend the 2018 Ultimate Fighter Season 1 reunion, and unfortunately in April of 2019 he was found deceased in his apartment at just 45 years old. Throughout his career, Sincaid was very open about his PTSD and his mental health struggles after time spent in the military, so there was a lot of questions being raised about that being a possibility for his passing. However, doctors suspected that he passed due to a heart attack. Just days before his passing, he actually used to post some pretty funny pictures and videos of his dog.
I love this motherfucker so much. You have no idea. No one will. Just me and him.
And I was able to find a post where his half-sister had stated that the dog's name is Tyson, and that after Sincaid's passing, Tyson was adopted by a friendly neighbor. Rest in peace, Lodune Sincaid, and my condolences go out to his family. Alex Karalexis was 4-0 going into the Ultimate Fighter house and was Randy Couture's 6th pick. Before getting onto the show, Karalexis was a professional soccer/football player, but had to walk away from the sport due to a reoccurring leg injury. He would have the unfortunate reality of having to take on Diego Sanchez in his first fight on the show and would lose by first-round submission. After the show, Karalexis will have 3 fights in the UFC, going 1-2 in those 3 fights, before making his way to the WEC, where he would have much more success. And at one point, he would even take on Anthony Pettis, who at the time was headed to superstardom. Karalexis will retire after losing his last bout by split decision and calling it a career with a record of 10-6. He now works with NFL Hall of Famer Jared Allen, where they help build homes for injured veterans. Nate Quarry is actually the first fighter on this list that would go on to have a very successful tenure with the UFC. Quarry grew up as a member of the Jehovah's Witness, but living in a violent and strict household pushed him away from the church. At the age of 24, he would be introduced to the sport of MMA, and after getting caught participating in sports which was not allowed, and also having a girlfriend which was also not allowed, he was excommunicated by the church and his family. He would go on to make his professional MMA debut in 2001 and never look back. After a 5-1 record, he would get a call from the UFC to join the Ultimate Fighter and was Randy Couture's first overall pick. In episode 1, Quarry accidentally cut himself on the chin after landing a takedown during training, but would continue to push forward. However, after injuring himself again in episode 5, but this time being his ankle, he would be forced to pull out of the competition as his injury would take many weeks to heal. He had to choose someone to replace him in the tournament, but since he was such a big favorite to win the show, he was offered and agreed to stay on as an assistant coach. After the show, Quarry would go on an absolute tear in the UFC, winning his first 3 fights all by first round knockout and earning him a shot at the middleweight title against UFC legend Rich Franklin. He would unfortunately lose this bout.
Again, on the body. And down goes Quarry. Cold. Wow. A first-round knockout is how Rich Franklin retains his belt.
But would bounce back with 2 more wins before suffering another defeat against one of the best jiu-jitsu fighters in UFC history in Damian Maia. After that, he would win his next 2 fights before calling it a career after losing to Jorge Rivera by TKO, causing him to undergo facial reconstruction surgery. He officially retired with a record of 13-4, and after retiring, he would become a co-host on MMA Uncensored and would temporarily come out of retirement to take on 19-year-old Jacob Beckman. Beckman was a fighter with Down syndrome who was able to fulfill his dream of getting in the cage and would take on Nate Quarry. Beckman was able to submit Quarry via leg lock and was crowned the world heavyweight champion. What's also interesting is that Nate created a comic book called Zombie Cage Fighter. I will leave a link in the description where you can grab his comic book and check out some of his cool merchandise they have. I know for sure I'll be picking up some. This is probably going to be by far the person we're going to talk about most in this video, and that is Chris Leben, who prior to even getting in the competition already had a pretty solid resume. He had been training at Team Quest alongside Randy Couture and Nate Quarry and other successful MMA fighters. He went undefeated as an amateur, and as a professional, he was able to win 3 titles in 3 different fight organizations. It was only a matter of time before he was somehow going to find his way into the UFC. Of course, being a training partner of Randy Couture, Couture would pick Leben as his second overall pick. And the moment Chris Leben appeared on screen, everyone already knew that if there were some shit to go down, this guy would definitely be in the center of it.
Boring as They have no personality at all. Nobody does in here.
And make no mistake that he was. Remember when I said there might have been other reasons why Jason Thacker was the first fighter to be sent home? Well, I guess you could say that Thacker and Leben didn't get along. Once entering the Ultimate Fighter house, Leben almost immediately began drinking heavily and constantly made fun of Thacker.
I don't have any resentment to Chris for picking on me. I think I had a big target, you know, coming from Canada and the country.
I like Jason. I mean, he sucks as a fighter, you know? He's garbage. Hey, Pokemon, did you shower yet?
I'm going right now.
You sucker.
At 2 a.m. while Thacker was in the shower, Leben pissed all over his bed and pillow.
You know what? I didn't take a leak on his bed. I spritzed. There's a difference. This little, you know, little sprinkle, little hey. Quit being such a retard.
And unfortunately, the next frame cuts to a freshly showered Jason Thacker unknowingly laying in a bed coated with Leben lemonade. In episode 2, Leben would get drunk again and hop a wall, escaping the Ultimate Fighter house and running to a payphone to call someone, which could have easily gotten him kicked off the show. He would later be forced to give an apology, which he did half-assedly. So of course, you already know there's gonna be more. In episode 5, Leben says something that triggers Bobby Southworth and all hell breaks loose.
Hey, you don't give a about anything, Chris.
You.
Chris, we know, brother.
You, why don't you knock me out? Hey, you're so bad.
I'll knock you out right now. Guys, don't talk shit, you fatherless bastard. Just shut your mouth.
That's not cool, dude. Come on, man.
Leben would decide to sleep outside to distance himself from the other fighters, just for Josh Koscheck and Bobby Southworth to spray water on him while he's sleeping, and all hell breaks loose again.
Chris, look, I'm out of here. It's the house, man. Bitch.
And because of this whole incident, Dana White decides it's a good idea that the next matchup should be Josh Koscheck versus Chris Leben.
I'm gonna be able to get Josh back. I'm gonna be able to crush his skull in, and not go to jail for it.
Koscheck would go on to defeat Leben by unanimous decision.
Next time, why you gonna hold me on the mat? You didn't hurt me at all.
It's a win.
It's a win.
You're a real
Exciting fighter. It's a win. You're a real
Go home!
hold me down, you little
Go home!
I'm not done with you yet, Josh. I'm not done with you yet.
Let's go.
But luck would actually be on Leben's side, as he was given a second chance due to Nate Quarry having to exit the competition due to an ankle injury. So Leben would fill in as a late replacement and take on Florian in episode 10, but would go through all that just to lose again, but this time by TKO due to a doctor stoppage, thus officially ending Leben's run in the competition. While dreadfully watching the show back, Jason Thacker learned about Leben's bedwetting prank and went to Dana White requesting to fight him, which ultimately was fulfilled. Leben would TKO Thacker in 95 seconds. Thacker would go on to disappear, while Leben would go on to cement himself as one of the toughest fighters in MMA history. Leben had an extremely fan-friendly style that would cause him to get rocked very often early on in fights, but then he would come back in dramatic fashion and knock out his opponent. Everyone who watched the show live, who could have possibly known that Leben would go on to have a long, illustrious career with the UFC, racking up several performance bonuses and competing against some of the biggest names in MMA history, like Anderson Silva, Michael Bisping, Vanderlei Silva, and the list goes on. After nearly a decade with the UFC, Leben would depart from the organization in 2013 after forfeiting on the stool in his loss against Uriah Hall. And in 2016, he would sign a multi-fight deal with Bellator, but wouldn't be allowed to fight due to a life-threatening abnormality in his heart.
What are they saying? Like one doctor, the grim doctor, said you could drop dead from a heart attack at any moment? Is that what they're trying to tell you?
Yeah. I mean, he even mentioned, getting me on the heart transplant list or something like that.
Several surgeries later, he refused to be sidelined any longer. In 2018, he was cleared to compete, but this time it would be in the bare knuckle fighting championship. After 3 wins and 2 losses in his new venture, Leben would officially retire from combat sports in 2021 after a TKO win, putting his fight record at 22-11.
But wait! There's more!
On a couple of occasions, Leben would test positive for banned substances in his system. Like after his fight against Michael Bisping, Leben would test positive for stanozolol, which was a popular performance-enhancing drug used by athletes, bodybuilders, and powerlifters. Because of this, he was suspended for 9 months and was fined a third of his fight purse. And then again, 3 years later, after his fight against Mark Munoz, Leben tested positive for oxycodone and oxymorphone, which got him suspended for another year. And after seeing everything that happened on the show, if you predicted that this guy would have trouble with the law, well, you guessed correctly. In 2008, Leben was arrested for violating his probation from a previous DUI charge and was held in jail without bond for 35 days. In 2010, he was arrested again in Hawaii for, who would have guessed, suspicion of driving under the influence after he crashed his truck into a wall. And then again in 2015, he was arrested on multiple charges after breaking into his ex-wife's apartment with a .45 caliber pistol and was charged with felony possession of a weapon and disobeying a court order by violating the restraining order his ex-wife had filed against him. He was sentenced to 120 days in jail and 3 years probation after release. However, this 2015 arrest actually made Leben want to turn over a new leaf and claims that he has remained sober ever since. In 2016, he completed Herb Dean's MMA referee course and was a referee for several UFC fights. And Leben is also now officially a judge for the UFC, as he was scheduled for 3 judging assignments just recently on UFC 311 earlier this year. And on top of all of that, he teaches MMA while being an advocate for clean eating and living a healthy lifestyle. I'm really happy to see how he's been able to turn his whole life around for the better. Bobby Southworth headed into the Ultimate Fighter house with a record of 6-3, with his most notable fight being a loss against Vitor Belfort in the Pride Fighting Championship. Bobby was Chuck Liddell's first overall pick and would go on to have some of the most memorable moments of the season. After Bobby came in last place for a challenge in episode 3, he would be forced to fight in an elimination bout, to which Team Liddell chose Lodune Sincaid as his opponent. Bobby would have to cut 20 pounds in just 24 hours, and after a very long, grueling process, Bobby would eventually make the weight. Despite the severe weight cut in such a short amount of time, Bobby would still go on to knock out Sincaid just 12 seconds into the second round. In episode 5, almost all the fighters would return to the house drunk after Dana White allowed them to have a night out, and later that night would be when Chris Leben would say something that would anger Bobby, and things would escalate further after Bobby called Leben a fatherless bastard. Eventually, Leben would calm down and he would go sleep outside away from everyone else in the house, when Bobby and Josh Koscheck thought it would be a good idea to pull a prank on Chris Leben by spraying water on him while he was sleeping. In his next fight, Bobby would take on Stephan Bonnar, to which he would lose by split decision. And another one of his viral moments on the show would come after this fight when Bobby and Dana White would start going at it.
Somebody who says like, no, Dana, I don't need a pep talk. I don't need one. I don't need a pep talk. And you don't really have any right. I'm not here to give you a pep talk. Why are you yelling at me? You don't have any right to yell at me, Dana. You know, Bobby, then I don't want to talk.
After the show, Bobby would lose his next fight, which was his only fight in the UFC, and then make his way over to Strikeforce. Initially, the move to Strikeforce didn't go as planned, with his first fight with the promotion ended in a no contest after just 17 seconds. But for some reason, immediately after, Bobby would be given a title shot and would become the Strikeforce light heavyweight champion, and then would go on to defend the title one time before losing it due to a cut. He would try to make his way back into the UFC again by trying out for the Ultimate Fighter Season 11, but the producers of the season ultimately decided to solely focus on the middleweights instead of having two different weight categories. So instead, he would fight again 2 years later in another promotion, but this would be his last fight, walking away from the sport after getting a first round knockout, finishing his professional fight career with a record of 10-6. He is now a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach at an American kickboxing academy over in San Antonio, Texas. Josh Rafferty joined the Ultimate Fighter with a record of 5-4. He wouldn't get much screen time because he was overshadowed by the absolute chaos that was Chris Leben and some of the other fighters, but he was Chuck Liddell's very last pick and would lose to Diego Sanchez by rear naked choke in the first round. He would also lose his UFC debut after that, and outside of the UFC, he would have his fair share of wins and losses and call it a career after a TKO loss over in Bellator. Fun fact about his career is that he's actually never made it to the final bell. In every single one of his fights, he's either finished his opponent inside the distance or he's gotten finished inside the distance, which I thought was very interesting. But eventually he retired with a record of 9-8 and now works as a jiu-jitsu and judo coach as well as being a personal trainer. Alex Schoenauer joined the UFC holding a record of 6-0 and would be the second to last pick on Team Liddell. He would lose his way out of the competition by losing to Forrest Griffin in the first round. And it's actually kind of funny because there's a good possibility that Schoenauer could have unintentionally been the reason for the UFC's demise because of his fight with Forrest Griffin, where he opened a cut over Griffin's left eye, which almost prevented him from fighting again in the competition. So I just can't help but wonder of what kind of butterfly effect would have taken place had Griffin not been able to continue in the competition. After the show, Alex would lose his next fight in the UFC, and like Josh Rafferty, he would have his fair share of wins and losses outside of the promotion, but then would finally retire in 2009 after a decision loss, calling it a career holding a record of 14-10. Interestingly enough though, Alex would go on to work in Hollywood as a stuntman. His IMDb page says he worked on films like Star Trek Beyond and Transformers Age of Extinction, which I thought was actually pretty impressive. On the show, he was basically the chef of the house, and you could still witness his culinary skills on his social media page as he posts about his healthy eating lifestyle and traveling ventures. Josh Koscheck came into the Ultimate Fighter house as a very accomplished wrestler. With his extensive background in wrestling, he got invited to the Ultimate Fighter after just 2 pro fights and of course winning them both. He was Chuck Liddell's second overall pick and was most memorable for helping Bobby cut the 20 pounds as well as the prank him and Bobby pulled on Chris Leben when he was sleeping outside. Of course, due to this prank, Dana White had him fight Chris Leben, to which he would win by unanimous decision, but then would lose out of the competition by losing to Diego Sanchez in the semifinals, but then would go on to have a very successful fighting career in the UFC. He would even go on to coach one of the best seasons in Ultimate Fighter history, coaching opposite of George St. Pierre.
Listen, bro.
Stop! Son of a bitch. Give me my plunger back.
I'm gonna run over there and probably just, get in George's face and motorboat his ass.
Which also granted him a title shot against the French-Canadian superstar. And along with GSP, he would fight many other MMA legends like Matt Hughes, Anthony Rumble Johnson, rest in peace, Robbie Lawler, and the list goes on. Koscheck had become the type of fighter similar to like a Chael Sonnen or a Colby Covington, where his character made you love him or absolutely hate him, and there was no in between.
Let's have a show of hands who likes Josh Koscheck. Who's a fan of Josh Koscheck? What, 7, 8? My opinion is if you've not If you like Josh Koscheck, then you've not met the guy.
Unfortunately, he would go on to lose his last 5 fights in the UFC before leaving the promotion and signing with Bellator. And in his promotional debut with Bellator, he would lose again, making it 6 losses in a row. And because of this, he would retire with a finishing record of 17-11. Josh Koscheck was the third and last person who decided to opt out of the Ultimate Fighter Season 1 reunion, and he doesn't ever really post on social media. In the past, he's talked about taking his hard work ethic that he's developed through wrestling and MMA and putting it towards the real world. Koscheck is now an entrepreneur with a history of successful businesses, and on his social media, you could tell he has a good passion for motocross racing. Sam Hoger was another undefeated fighter who joined the Ultimate Fighter house, holding a record of 4-0 and a 100% finishing rate. He was picked 4th by Chuck Liddell and was infamously accused of stealing from the other fighters in episode 9 of the show.
What do you know? He has 5 beanies. 3 guys in the house are missing their beanies. He has 4 hats. 3 guys in the house are missing their hats.
He would lose to Forrest Griffin by TKO in the light heavyweight semifinals, and in the UFC he would go on to fight legends like Stephan Bonnar, Rashad Evans, and Lyoto Machida. However, after consecutive losses to Rashad Evans and Lyoto Machida, he would leave the UFC, and he would end his career on a 4-fight winning streak in some smaller organization and even winning a title. He retired with a record of 10-4 and has opened up several different gyms over the years, with his most recent venture being the Real Martial Arts Gym in Houston, Texas. Mike Swick began his pro MMA career on smaller shows and in the WEC, where he was able to rack up a 5-0 record before losing to Chris Leben in the WEC right before getting on the show. He was Randy Couture's 4th pick and would constantly get annoyed by Chris Leben because Leben just kept bragging and bringing up their fight.
If you're gonna keep bringing this up, bro, all we have to do is get through this period, and me and you can step in the ring the day after.
I'm not bringing nothing up.
He would ultimately end up losing to Stephan Bonnar in the light heavyweight semifinals, but then would go on to have a very long and successful career with the UFC. He would go on a 4-fight win streak before losing to MMA legend Yushin Okami, and then go on another 4-fight win streak before losing to Dan Hardy. After this, he would lose 3 of his next 4 bouts, therefore causing him to retire in 2015 after a decision loss with a final record of 15-6. Ever since retiring, he has focused on an AKA gym that he opened up over in Thailand, which has had immense success bringing in celebrities, fighters, and the gym has also earned the title of being the best Muay Thai school in Thailand. This gym seriously looks amazing. Kenny Florian came into the Ultimate Fighter house with a record of 2-1 and was Chuck Liddell's 6th pick overall. In the middleweight semifinals, Florian would TKO Chris Leben, earning him a spot in the finale, to which then he would lose to Diego Sanchez in the finals. He would go on to have a very successful fight career in the UFC, getting many performance bonuses along the way, and even earning a title shot against Sean Shirk, which he lost by decision. After that, he would go on a 6-fight win streak and challenge the all-time great BJ Penn for his title, but in that second title shot, he would lose by rear naked choke, and then eventually he would work his way up to a 3rd title shot against another all-time great in Jose Aldo, but would go 0-3 in title fights when he lost to Jose Aldo by decision, and after that fight he would retire from the octagon with a record of 14-6. Kenny Florian became considered as one of the best MMA fighters to never win a title, but since he has found immense success as a color commentator. He now hosts a podcast with John Anik where they bring on guests and they talk about anything UFC and other fight related topics. I'll leave a link to their podcast in the description below. Diego Sanchez is probably the most recognizable name and face from the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. Before the UFC, he was a high school wrestling state champion, and he had already racked up an impressive 11-0 record, including a title win in another organization. He had knocked out or submitted 10 of his 11 opponents, and on the show, it was no different. He was Chuck Liddell's 3rd pick, and immediately you could tell this guy was a character.
Apparently, Diego Sanchez is doing some kind of yoga bodybuilding pose down with baby oil all over his body.
Almost immediately upon entering the house, he gets into an argument with Stephan Bonnar over asparagus.
You're my dad, do something about it.
I don't know if I'm your dad for sure. There's a very good possibility.
He would submit Josh Rafferty in the first round, and then in the semifinals, he would go on to beat Josh Koscheck. And then, of course, in the finale, he would TKO Kenny Florian to make him the first Ultimate Fighter winner and 6-figure contract earner. He would go on to have an absolute legendary career, which included defeating Nick Diaz, having an absolute war with Clay Guida.
Oh my God, swinging! Oh my God, unbelievable start! Oh, Diego's all over!
getting a title shot against BJ Penn, having another war with Gilbert Melendez, and accomplishing so much more throughout his 15-year tenure with the UFC. Of course, a certain someone would come along and take advantage of him, but I refuse to give that loser any more attention than he's already got. Diego would ultimately walk away from the promotion after a controversial DQ win over Michel Pereira, followed by a loss to Jake Matthews. And in the latter stages of his career, the UFC had seen immense growth, and unfortunately Diego having some clown alongside him unfortunately somewhat ruined his reputation in the eyes of many fans, so people would cheer and be happy to watch him lose. But I'd like to think that the OGs who watched him from the very beginning never gave up on him and always had his back. After leaving the UFC in 2021, he would fight Kevin Lee in Khabib's organization Eagle FC, and then make his way over to the BKFC ring, where for some reason that he would be fed to a former boxing world champion in Austin Trout, and of course that fight went as expected. To this day, Diego Sanchez still trains and seems like he's trying to get a boxing match with someone on the Rampage Jackson versus Rashad Evans undercard. The event was supposed to take place a couple weeks ago, but they've had to postpone it, so it looks like Diego isn't quite done fighting yet. His record currently stands at 30 wins and 14 losses, and it'll be interesting to see how much longer he plans to fight. Like Diego Sanchez, Stephan Bonnar also already had a solid resume before getting a call for the Ultimate Fighter. At the time, Bonnar was 7-1 with his only loss being to MMA legend Lyoto Machida, and he also earned a title in a smaller organization. Also, 6 of his 7 wins were all by stoppage. However, on the show, things wouldn't start off too good for Bonnar, as straight away in episode 1, a headbutt while sparring would cause him to need stitches. He ended up being Randy Couture's 3rd pick, and he would beat Bobby Southworth by split decision in his first fight on the show, and then beat Mike Swick by submission in the semifinals. And in the finale, him and Forrest Griffin would put on the most famous fight in UFC history. The fight that would completely save the promotion.
Season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter literally saved the UFC.
And would cement the entire cast of this show in the history books. Bonnar and Griffin went to absolute war.
Stephan Bonnar staying in the pocket. The crowd in here is just on its feet. Oh, uppercut just missed. Toe to toe they go. Oh, and a left hand. Right hand by Bonnar. Good right hand. Muay Thai clinch and a big knee by Bonnar. Forces rock.
And Bonnar would unfortunately see himself on the losing end of a decision after a very, very hard fought battle. The fight was so great, Dana White would also award Bonnar with a 6-figure contract with the UFC despite losing, and of course he also would go on to have a successful career with the promotion. He would fight legends like Rashad Evans, Mark Coleman, and Anderson Silva. In 2012, he would lose by TKO to Anderson Silva, which would push him into retirement, but later would come out of retirement and sign with Bellator. His next fight in Bellator would be his final fight, and it would be a split decision loss to Tito Ortiz, and then he would officially call it a career with a record of 15-9. In 2013, he was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, and he would even make a small stint in pro wrestling from 2017 to 2021. He has also made appearances as an analyst for the UFC, and he was even appointed as the president of a smaller MMA organization. However, I regret to inform you that sadly on December 22nd in 2022, Stephan Bonnar passed away at the age of 45. It was later revealed that he had passed away from an accidental fentanyl overdose. His legacy will remain in history forever, and I will certainly never forget the impact he's had on the sport. I was able to find a GoFundMe page that was still up for his family. I will put the link to it down in the description below, and my condolences go out to his family and friends. Forrest Griffin is the last cast member we're going to talk about on this list, and going into the Ultimate Fighter house, Forrest was one of the most experienced fighters that were on this cast. He held a record of 9-2 with a notable win over Chael Sonnen, and before going on the show, Forrest had actually retired from the sport and began to pursue a career in law enforcement. But Dana White had came to him and was able to convince him of coming out of retirement and entering into the Ultimate Fighter competition. On the show, Forrest Griffin was Chuck Liddell's 5th overall pick, and there's a funny moment that Forrest became subject to when Chris Leben was going on an absolute rampage. He ended up punching Forrest Griffin's door in half, and Griffin would unintentionally make a funny comment about pieces of the door being in his bed.
So there I am, asleep in my bed. All of a sudden I'm having this dream where God's like yelling at me, but it turns out it's not really God at all. It's Chris Liebman, and he's busted through my door. There are pieces of my door in my bed. He's like, hey, where's Koscheck? And I look at him and I say, are you out of your mine.
Forrest would make Alex Schoenauer tap due to strikes in his first fight and would receive a pretty bad cut in the process, which could have rendered him unable to continue the competition. Luckily, he would be cleared to fight and then go on to defeat Sam Hoger by TKO in the semifinals. He would have that legendary fight with Stephan Bonnar, and along with Diego Sanchez would become one of the first winners in The Ultimate Fighter, while at the same time etching himself in history. After the show, he would go on to win his first 2 fights with the UFC, but then would suffer a controversial split decision loss to Tito Ortiz. After winning 3 of his next 4 fights, he would be awarded a title shot against Quentin Rampage Jackson, who at the time was one of the most intimidating and scariest fighters on the UFC roster. Forrest got the opportunity to coach season 7 of The Ultimate Fighter opposite Quentin Rampage Jackson, leading to some pretty viral moments.
Show me the animal! Animal! I want the animal, damn it! Come on, man! Man! Damn it, man! What the
And then he would face Rampage at UFC 86, where he was a massive underdog, many people believing Rampage would knock him out. But Forrest Griffin would go on to shock the world, upset Rampage Jackson, and become the undisputed light heavyweight champion of the world. And at the time, that was a massive accomplishment, as this light heavyweight division was loaded with the biggest names and the best fighters on the planet. But because this division was so stacked, that title was being handed around left, right, front, and center. Everyone was able to get a piece of it because just the competition was unbelievable. And because of this, he had to face Rashad Evans in his first title defense, to which he would lose the title. And then after that, he would get virally knocked out by Anderson Silva. He would go on to fight even more legend after that, before calling it a career in 2012 after a decision win over Tito Ortiz, coming out on top in their trilogy. He retired with a record of 19-7, and after retiring, he would make appearances in several different films. He would be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, and he would be hired by the UFC as Vice President of Athlete Development. With this title with the UFC, you can often see him at the UFC Performance Institute, which is the UFC's state-of-the-art training facility for any and all combat sports athletes. And you can also find him preventing people's heads from bouncing off the power slap canvas after getting a palm strike straight into the ER, because God knows they won't remember anything in between. And just in case if you were wondering, the coaches would square off at UFC 52, where Chuck Liddell would KO Randy Couture in the first round.